Hello, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Branaghan. So you were the lead author of Chapter 1, Designing for Medical Device Safety, of the book published this year, Design for Health, Applications of Human Factors. I'm super excited to ask you a few questions about the chapter and yourself. So why don't we get started with you telling us a little bit about your work and your research focuses.
Sure. So I work for a company. In fact, I'm president of a company called Research Collective, and it's a human factors and user experience research and design consultancy. And our focus is in medical products or healthcare products of all kinds, medical devices and so forth. And we help companies in everything from, identifying opportunities up front, from understanding how patients, healthcare providers, and others use their current products, identifying new needs, that kind of thing, but also helping them to both design and evaluate and kind of iteratively do, sequences of those things time and time again, to the point where they have a really strong product, and thereafter often help them get provide data and so forth to the as to the safety for submission to regulatory agencies like FDA and other agencies. So our job in life is to try to make especially medical devices and medical products as easy to use and efficient to learn and so forth as possible.
Fantastic, thank you.
Sure.
So my understanding is, and just to ask, my understanding is that Research Collective, the way that you formatted your research is a little bit, is very unique from the typical undergraduate, or not, excuse me, not undergraduate, but graduate research, university level research. So can you explain how you got to that point?
Yeah, I started out actually in industry, working for HP and then IBM after doing a PhD in cognitive psychology. And so I got really interested in product development over time, and that led into consulting opportunities and things like that. In these consulting opportunities, typically, you're interested in designing products and making sure those products are particularly easy and efficient for people to use. Turns out that is a perfect match for anything involving healthcare. Simply because in healthcare, not only do you want to design things that are easy to use and sell well and make people satisfied, but there are all kinds of issues related to reducing the likelihood of use error. So use error is this notion of somebody is using a product, they're meaning to do it just right, but because humans are humans and we have a tendency to make errors, especially when a product that we're using is difficult to use, they end up making errors with the product, and it can potentially cause harm. So it can cause that harm to the patient, it could cause it to a caregiver, to a healthcare provider, any number of people. So we recognized that, like everybody else in human factors, that humans have they have magnificent capabilities, really, but they also have some very serious limitations. And when these products aren't designed to sort of take advantage of those capabilities and to mitigate those limitations, some pretty nasty things can happen. And so that's really been the focus of our work, is to help companies in particular, folks that are designing healthcare products and medical devices, make sure that they're not only, they're not only easy to use, but in particular safe, and reduce the likelihood of this error.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I remember I read your chapter earlier this summer, and I thought the way that it went through, not just, there were several things you talked about that I wouldn't normally think is relating to medical device safety. I believe at one point in the chapter, labeling was
absolutely
discussed. And
yeah.
when I thought about it, I realized how crucial talking about or at least directing whoever's using it is, how crucial that is to get correct.
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, regulatory agencies like FDA in particular have focused on labeling quite a bit lately. And it's important to notice that, to note that when we talk about labeling, usually we think about labels on products, like the names of things, but it also includes all the instructions for use and training and things like that. And as you know, one of the things that happens as products get more and more complex, they tend to have more and more of these instructions that go along with them. And it's a designed, product just like everything else. So we often talk about the user experience, for example, especially in association with human factors. Well, this user experience is everything the user comes into contact with, everything they run across. And of course, the instructions for use and the labels are a big part of that. And in fact, there have been plenty of pretty tragic situations in which instructions for use have not been up to par, and people have suffered either injuries or death. So it turns out to be pretty darn important. One of the things we've been doing lately is we will eye track people as they're reading these instructions for use. And we see sort of two patterns emerge. One is if somebody makes a mistake, let's say, as they're using these instructions for use, we'll notice that their eyes sort of show one of two patterns. One, they're kind of bouncing around all over the page as they're looking for the place they're supposed to focus. So that's one, they're just not finding what they're looking for. And then another one is they'll read something and then they'll go back and read it again. And then they'll go back and read it again. So we sometimes call them regression types of problems, different than the statistics regression. But that tells us there's something that's confusing about that sentence. So in one situation, it's a findability problem. They just can't, whatever they're looking for isn't salient enough for them to pick it up. In the other one, it's more of a comprehension problem. So for example, maybe we're using words they're not familiar with, or maybe it's an awkwardly worded sentence. But those are two different solutions. So anyway, obviously this labeling business that you're talking about is pretty important stuff.
Well, the whole regression or reading things over and over again really reminds me as a student
Yes.
of the feeling that I think a lot of students get when they're reading a textbook that they don't understand, and you just end up reading the same paragraph over and over again. And you're right.
Absolutely.
There's something breaking up the comprehension. Is it a term that we don't understand? Is it the way that it's worded? What about it creates a problem where we have to read this over and over again?
That's exactly right. And you probably experienced this previously as a new graduate student, where you get into a new area and you just don't have the mental model to really, understand what you're looking for too. So there's a long history in cognitive psychology of the more adept we get at something, well, the easier it is to pick up new material about it because we have a mental model to kind of attach new concepts to. Boy, if I remember this when I was a grad student, you jump into a new area and suddenly you're hanging on every sentence. And you don't want that when you're dealing with a medical product, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I completely understand.
Yeah.
So let me ask, we've gotten a little bit into some more detailed things in the chapter, but can you go ahead and give us an overview of the chapter that you wrote again, Designing for Medical Device Safety?
Sure. So I think it was really, the notion was to introduce how human factors fits into the design of medical products. And, some time ago, FDA had come up with a document that they call HE75, so for Human Engineering 75. And at least I believe that's what HE was for. They also came up with what they called human factors guidance. And human factors guidance was sort of a way that, a method one would follow to make sure that the products you're designing don't introduce undue risk of use error. And when you read through this, actually, it's very good documentation. It's very good guidance. But being a previous professor and also working in this area, you recognize right away that this is a simple human-centered design approach. In other words, it focuses mainly, it has three components. It starts with focusing on the users and their tasks and their needs, and doing that not only early, but constantly throughout. And then second, using actual data to guide our design decisions. So don't use only intuition or how it's always been done before, but use real honest goodness human performance data, for example, to guide our design. And then third, iteration. Amazing, the first time you come out with a product or a prototype, it's not the ideal. So you have to iterate multiple times. Well, so the approach to this chapter was really to lay that out, how to do that with medical devices. So we sort of laid that out. In fact, I don't mind looking at it here for a second. I think we included a graphic for how to go about doing that. But there it is. But the first part of this graphic is what we're really doing is we're characterizing our users. What are their cognitive and physical capabilities and limitations and so forth, their environments, where are they actually conducting these tasks, what's the lighting like, what's the noise level like, all of those kinds of things. The user interfaces that they're using, do they include things like labeling and documentation and so forth? And also even known issues. So lots of products are based on predicate products that have come before it. Lots of times those have known sort of usability problems. And when that's the case, well, you better take that into account in the new design. So that's that part where we're understanding users and their tasks and their environments. That's a research part, and people in human factors love that stuff. And then the second part is to kind of identify the critical issues. So those tasks, for example, that could cause a person harm. And those are things that you are absolutely going to have to usability test in a simulated use usability test. So anything that could potentially hurt somebody, well, you want to design that out if at all possible. In fact, you really do need to design it out. And then you enter another part that human factors and design folks are familiar with, which is formative usability testing. So basically, the idea behind a formative usability testing test is you are kind of identifying where the usability problems are. And if you can identify those, well, you can usually fix them, or often anyway. So you do that in a very fast, iterative way until you get to a point where you're ready to do some validation testing. And we tend to think about, if you've done everything else right, your validation testing, these are the data that you submit to FDA or another regulatory agency. This really ought to be a victory lap for you. You should have done all of your other formative testing so well that you have real confidence going into that validation test. And I've gone into both kinds of situations, one where you're not so sure and one where you're pretty sure. And the one where you're pretty sure is a lot more fun. So that's what we're aiming for. And then finally, you submit all of that information and so forth. And what you've done is you've taken into account at the beginning the user's needs and their environments and so forth. You've gone through a design process. You've kind of validated your design. And then once it gets out into the market, you don't stop there. You kind of monitor how that product is doing. And you do it for a couple reasons. One, you want to fix any kind of usability problems so that we keep it safe. But the other one is, chances are you're going to come up with an update to this product, and you're going to need that feedback loop to see, well, how else can I make this product better? So that's kind of the idea. But if you look at it, even though FDA did a beautiful job in laying out this process, all it really is this very simple, straightforward, smart, human-centered design process.
often my understanding is that most products that come onto the market are, a progression on something else. So what you're saying
Yeah.
about having to create that process of looking over and over again about what could go wrong and what needs to be improved makes a lot of sense, considering that most things that come onto the market are not, completely new Tesla
Right.
ideas.
Yep.
I mean, most
Yep.
things, you don't come out, there's not really a new way to toast bread. It's
Right.
just an iteration on something new, or
Exactly.
something older, excuse me.
Yep. I think that's true. The other thing I think that's really important about this is it provides a process where the human factors person is required to be every bit as rigorous as every other kind of engineer. So if you look at most organizations, they're chock full, especially product development organizations, they're chock full of electrical engineers and mechanical engineers and some industrial engineers. And these folks are really expert at what they do. So electrical engineers know an awful lot about electronics, for example. Well, it's rare, it's much rarer that you have experts about human beings in these organizations. But it's the human factors engineer, it's their job to be as expert about human beings as possible. And it turns out the human beings are probably the most important part of the whole darn system. They're the most variable, they're the most maddening. They're the people that use the system, buy the system, train other people on the system, review the system, um, even make the system. So eventually somebody, given that the human is such an important part of this system, has to be an expert on the humans. And that's really what human factors engineering is trying to do. If we can understand these capabilities and limitations, it's similar to understanding the capabilities and limitations of materials. If you were to take a strength of materials class, you need to know what people are good at and what they're not so good at, and under what conditions they're going to perform best.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So can you pinpoint the most important takeaway from this chapter for designers, researchers, and other people interested in this topic?
Yeah, I really think there's two parts. And I think this is true about human factors and product development in general. So I talked about one component is having a process to follow. And this process being a human-centered design process and how critical that is. The other part is the component of understanding human capabilities and limitations to begin with. So just following the process is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's necessary, it's what regulatory agencies expect of you. But in order for this really to turn out right, you do need to have experts in areas related to learning and memory and decision making and visual perception and auditory perception, and biomechanics, so that you understand, boy, how are we going to make the smallest person fit and the smallest person be able to reach something and the largest person to be able to fit in something. So it really requires both. You need this content knowledge of how humans work. And then you also need this procedural knowledge about how the design process ought to work. And if you can marry those two things, well, you've got a real engineering discipline and you end up designing better and better products. But if one of them's missing, you get the results that you would expect.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today.
Of course, my pleasure.
ACE Lab and all of us were very excited to share more about, your contributions to design for health.
Great.
And we look forward to collaborating with you more.
Sounds good. I'll look forward to it as well.